Okay, welcome to the last video for this lesson in the renal section. We've covered potassium, how the nephron handles potassium and how that's controlled. And now let's talk a little bit about calcium and phosphate and how that's controlled in the kidney. So the purpose of this is not to cover calcium homeostasis, covered elsewhere in the curriculum. But we do want to concentrate on how the kidney works, because the kidney is the primary, just like potassium, it's the primary way that your body gets rid of calcium and where you get a calcium balance between what's coming in through your diet and what's going out, okay? So the plasma calcium level, really important to regulate, because calcium is an important ion in the body. As you guys know, it's important for basically everything. It's a hugely important second messenger system, hugely important for your bones. So you want to maintain that plasma calcium at as constant and normal level as possible. And because the kidney is the primary way that you get calcium out of your body, it is fairly important in terms of regulating the exit point. The excretion of calcium is a fairly important mechanism for keeping this plasma calcium where it belongs, okay? And that is really the major point that I want to make here. We're going to talk about the details of how the nephron itself handles calcium here. Of course, as you know, vitamin D also is involved in calcium regulation here. And I just want to point out, as is presented in detail elsewhere, right? But the final step in producing this active form is actually performed in the kidney. If you have kidney disease, you can get signs of vitamin D deficiency, rickets, okay? So bear that in mind. It may be something that you'll get from the pathology people and pathophysiology people. They will note that the effects of vitamin D, you may get signs of vitamin D deficiency with kidney disease, okay? But what I really want to concentrate on here, what the major point is, because again, as you know, the calcium homeostasis is really covered elsewhere. I just want to talk about the specifics in terms of what happens at the nephron, which is not covered elsewhere. Because we're saving it for this, right? This is a logical place to study this. So first of all, you will note that the calcium is freely filtered. So the concentration here is basically equal to the free plasma concentration. Now, a large proportion of the calcium is actually bound to proteins in the plasma, and that is not filtered. Only the calcium in the plasma is filtered, but nevertheless, that's about half the calcium in the plasma. So right now, 100% here means the plasma calcium level is equal to the calcium level in the tubular fluid in Bowman space, okay? So 60%, the majority of the calcium is reabsorbed paracellularly in the proximal tubule, and this is really the same as the potassium. You're losing water here. Water is being reabsorbed, and as the water is reabsorbed, the calcium concentration goes up. As the calcium concentration in the tubule goes up, you create a gradient for calcium, high here, low in the interstitium, and you get calcium reabsorption paracellularly through the epithelial layer here, and that's primarily how this calcium reabsorption takes place. And then you've got anywhere from 1 to 3% of the calcium left in the urine. So that means that 39 to 37% is actually reabsorbed in the distal, primarily in the distal nephron here. We're going to talk once again about the principal cells where the regulation really happens, okay, where most of it happens. But the rest of that is controlled here, okay? All right, so actually, this is distal convoluted tubule. I think I said principal cell. Apologize for that, okay? And 37 to 39% is reabsorbed here in the collecting duct in the distal nephron. And most of that happens in the distal convoluted tubule, and that's what I'm going to talk about here. So here we have a distal convoluted tubule cell, and you will note this calcium channel here in the apical membrane of this cell. This is the primary way that calcium gets across from the tubular lumen into the cell, and you will also note that this channel, the activity of this channel is regulated by PTH or parathyroid hormone. So your plasma calcium, if it drops, you secrete parathyroid hormone from the parathyroid gland, and the PTH causes more calcium channels to be, causes an increase in the activity of these calcium channels. You get more calcium reabsorbed from tubular fluid into the cell through that channel when high PTH is present, so you get an increase in calcium reabsorption in the face of a low plasma calcium, okay? So the second step in that reabsorption, after getting across the apical membrane, you get across the basolateral membrane. That happens either via this SL calcium pump or via the sodium calcium exchanger, okay? And you get calcium transport across the basolateral membrane the rest of the way. So in summary, from tubular lumen to interstitial space, okay? So let's talk a little bit about phosphate here. So you will note that like potassium and like calcium, it is freely filtered. There is some potassium bound to proteins as well. Like calcium, there is some bound to protein in the plasma, but what's free in the plasma is freely filtered. So the concentration in Bowman's capsule, again, equal to the plasma concentration of phosphate, free phosphate. And 75% of what's filtered is actually reabsorbed in the proximal tubule, and that is mostly through this sodium phosphate cotransporter. The sodium goes down its electrochemical gradient, and it drives the transport of phosphate from the tubular lumen into the cell here, and that is the primary route for reabsorption. It is transcellular. It is a transport maximum process, and in fact, the tubular lumen is normally high enough, the concentration of phosphate in the tubular lumen is high enough to where you're pretty much operating at the transport maximum normally all the time. And any increase above normal pretty much ends up in the urine because you can't reabsorb any more. This transporter is operating as fast as it possibly can, okay? And that can be fortuitous because the tubular, the phosphate is a buffer for hydrogen ions. So it can help you dump hydrogen ions if you have a high plasma, a low plasma pH. Okay, because so let's take a look at it and see how this works. Let's say you have an acidosis, high proton concentration in the plasma. That actually increases phosphate release from bone. So it actually drives plasma phosphate up. And because you have high plasma phosphate, you get more filtered. Because you get more filtered, and because this transporter is already operating at the transport maximum, the extra that you filter ends up in the lumen, and it binds to hydrogen ions. And so it helps you excrete hydrogen ions, and because they get excreted along with the phosphate, it helps you excrete hydrogen ions from the body, and it helps you correct the acidosis. In addition to that, you should note that high phosphate in the plasma is a stimulus for PTH release. Now, low calcium is a stronger stimulus, but nevertheless, high phosphate can increase PTH as well. That decreases phosphate reabsorption in the proximal tubule here, which, first of all, will help you drop your phosphate concentration in the plasma back toward normal. Okay, so it helps correct the phosphate imbalance, bring the phosphate concentration back down. It also, at the same time, leaves more phosphate in the tubular lumen, which means there's more phosphate here to bind protons, which means that you get even more help with the excretion of protons in this system. So that's how phosphate can help us with our acid base, okay? Now, we're going to talk about the details of the acid base in a later lesson, but just to introduce it here along with phosphate transport mechanisms in context. So that's it for this lesson. Thank you for your attention, and I'll see you in the rooms.